All set.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to kick us off and just provide a very, very small amount of context here. What we're talking about today is, well, you can see it on the screen, but it is this capital improvement plan budget book, which in my 4 years on council, we received, and then very shortly thereafter had a hearing about this particular portion of the budget, and then later had larger budget hearings and then voted on the whole thing all at once. And we had talked amongst council about trying to streamline some of that a little bit and make sure that there was appropriate context for the CIP within the overall budget, and a real understanding of how CIP works, I think, is more important now than ever before, with ARPA dollars, with the infrastructure dollars from the federal government. And so rather than jumping right from the release of this capital improvement plan into a budget hearing, we asked the Evans administration, and I see we have the deputy mayor. I don't know if Mayor Evans is on. I know we have the deputy mayor and we have the director of OMB, Mike Burns, on the call to really, frankly, do a capital improvement plan 101 for us on council, for us to be able to really understand what is in this book. This is not intended to be a budget hearing, and I'd really appreciate it if we wouldn't treat it as such and really just hear what the administration has to say in terms of the context of this book, and any questions that are broad and specific we'll have time for at the end. But we will actually have a hearing on this budget book later on in May. So with that, I will pass it along to the deputy mayor and to the OMB director Burns. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember Gruber, and good to be with each of you this afternoon to provide this overview. And hopefully you'll find this helpful in your understanding and in your preparation for the hearing that we'll have on CIP later next month. So if we can go to the next slide. So I will provide an overview here, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And a bit later on, something to give you to look forward to after you've had to listen to me for a bit. We'll hear from Commissioners Perrin and Miller with regard to certain sections of the book. So we can go to the next slide. Great. So the goals of, if we just go back one, of this work session presentation are to review how the CIP book can be read. I will confess that upon picking this book up for the first time, and maybe I'm the only one who feels this way, but it was not self-explanatory. I wish that it was. I think a goal going forward is that when we make this information available, that we will work on putting it in a format that is more self-explanatory, but in fact it is not. So we're going to review how the book can be read. We're going to talk about how capital funding works overall here at the city, both in terms of cash capital and in terms of debt. We're going to provide an overview of how our CIP development process works internally, which spans over a number of months. We're going to identify the various categories into which these projects fall. And then we'll offer a brief overview of the 22-23 CIP and how that breaks down. And of course, we'll have time briefly at the end for Q&A. So with that, as our game plan, we will go to the next slide. So in its simplest form, the CIP is a 5-year plan of investments in the city's infrastructure. And you can see there the cover of the book that hopefully all of you received, or if not, you will, because hard copies are available for all members of council. So there's the cover page of that plan. And then the book includes the contents of the plan organized into 2 sections. One of them being focused on financial summaries, and then the meat of the program, the projects themselves. And we'll talk more about all of that as we go. So if we look at the financial summaries section, the CIP is broken down into 3 different types of financial summaries. And the slide that we're looking at here is the summary by funding source. And you can see, we look at debt, cash capital across various departments, federal funding, state funding, so on and so forth. But that's one view through which the financials of the CIP can be reviewed. And then if you look further on, we present the CIP in summary form by category. So arts and culture being one category that's circled, and you can see some others that are up on the slide that's up, kind of, intuitive, be it business equipment, economic development, and the like. We also present the summary by department. So environmental services highlighted here, and some other departments listed as well. So that is what we show at a summary level. So if you're just looking quickly to understand how much we spend in a category, or plan to spend in a category, a department, or by funding source, that's where you go. And those are sections A, B, C, and are generally located in the front of the book. So then we get into looking at the program by category section. And projects are organized into major categories. So here on this slide, highlighted, you see the excerpt for public safety. So if you want to look for a particular category, you'll have that in the book in the top right-hand corner of each page once you get into that section. And we've got a number of different categories, be they arts and culture, economic development, public safety, public waterfront, transportation infrastructure, among others. And we'll talk about those a bit later on and what's contained within each of them. And then we get into subcategories. So again, sticking with public safety, you can see there are a number of subcategories. 2 of them highlighted here from this excerpt, being fire apparatus and small equipment. And there are certainly a number of others within public safety. So just an example here again of kind of tracking through the breakdown of a particular section. And then finally, we talk about the specific projects or programs themselves. So the project title, brief description, and what the funding plan is over 5 years and the source of those funds. So you can see highlighted within public safety, within the small equipment subcategory, we've highlighted fire small equipment, right? So that's the title, the brief description, and in this case, it really is brief. Scheduled replacement, new purchase of small fire suppression equipment. And then you can see there the funding source over the 5 years. So again, just taking you through how that lays out. And I think it's important to note here that dollar amounts presented are in thousands of dollars. So said another way, we are not spending $10 a year on animal services equipment. But we are, in fact, planning to spend $10,000 a year. So just an important detail about the numbering convention that we use.
Mike, can I ask one question? Maybe you're going to get to it later, and if so, just let me know. Is there a time that you're going to explain the kind of idea of out years and how the 5 years works?
That's a good question, and so I think. To answer it now at a high level, and we'll kind of cover it as we go along, I would say that the most refined year in the 5-year plan is year 1. that's the year that's in the budget that you'll approve. And we budget for the cash capital piece as a line item in the operating budget. We budget for debt service as a line item in the operating budget. So that's the most refined. The out years is, I would describe it as a complete inventory of all of the capital work that we want to do in the particular categories. But as time passes, those numbers become more refined. We priority shift, and so I think the most refined number is year one, and then the out years become refined as we get into the budget cycle for those out years.
Got it. I have to imagine that some of my colleagues are going to have some more questions about that, but I think we can keep going with the presentation and we can have those come at the end.
Okay, that sounds good. Yep. So let's talk about now how capital projects are funded. So cash capital is a term that I think most of you are probably familiar with. And so that represents cash that is set aside to fund certain of our capital projects compared to debt, which we'll talk about in a bit. We use cash capital for items that have a shorter useful life, things like IT equipment, firefighting apparatus, development of a website, software purchases, and the like. And from a budget perspective, as I was mentioning earlier, we budget for cash capital as an operating expense within each of our funds. And I'll spare everybody a lecture on fund accounting, but I'm sure you're all familiar with the general fund, which is our largest, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the other funds that we have, be they water, refuse, local works, parking, et cetera. But within each of those funds, we budget cash capital from an operating budget perspective. So that then leads us to the other mechanism, or one of the other mechanisms that we use to fund capital projects, and that's debt. So we use debt where we're dealing with longer term items. And so we issue bonds and notes and use the proceeds from those issuances to finance specific projects. State law governs the kinds of projects we can finance with bond proceeds. In that they have to have a useful life of 5 years or more. So if it's something shorter than that, we're using cash capital. Longer term, we would be using debt. And it's important to note that we're limited in what we can borrow in any given year, and that's referred to as the tax-supported debt limit. And that limit's self-imposed by the city. And it's approved through legislation by council in June of each year. And some of you who have been on council for a bit will recall that among the many resolutions that tend to go at the June meeting in connection with the upcoming year's budget. So as we're talking about debt, I think it's important to raise some other relevant points. Our bond rating, which the city has historically had strong bond ratings, that represents the city's ability and willingness to pay the annual principal and interest that are due on outstanding debt. And that rating is, I would say, generally updated at least once a year. It's each time that bonds are sold in the market. You see here under tax supported debt limit, the term debt service. And that's the total amount of interest and principal due each year to pay down existing debt obligations. And I should note that it's the city's practice to bond for half the allowable useful life of a project, or a minimum 5 years, whichever is greater. That means that we pay down debt more quickly, less interest costs, and it positively impacts our bond rating because we're financially able to do that. So again, I think important to note too, and this is something that I've observed as someone coming into this, that What we're talking about here, these disciplines around the capital improvement program, but more importantly, the refinement around cash capital and debt service and distinguishing between the two is really a discipline that has existed here at the city for a long time through many prior administrations, finance directors, budget directors, and I think it's fair to say in its origins goes back at least 40 years. So it's a long-standing tradition and certainly is reflected in our bond rating, among other things. So we've talked about cash, we've talked about debt, and there are other sources of funding that are used for capital projects, and they may be state funded. For example, New York State Department of Transportation or Empire State Development, any grants that we receive through those state agencies, among others. They can be federally funded, be it a community development block grant or ARPA, which we're all familiar with now, could receive funding from the county. And we could receive funding from private sources as well. For example, the library has a foundation that's a 501c3. Other community foundations could certainly provide funding that is used to fund our capital improvement program and the projects that we undertake. So myriad of funding sources there. So now that we've talked about funding sources, let's talk about the development cycle for the program for the CIP. It's not quite a year-round process, but it's close. So it begins in September, culminates with receipt of requests and review of those by the investment priorities team. They begin to meet and review those requests, and that's a group comprised of representation across all citywide departments because generally most all departments submit requests of some kind. Those flow through OMB. They're reviewed by the team and prioritized for funding. The mayor receives a draft of the 5-year plan. That gets us through December. January through March, the draft is finalized. And you can see where we are right here in April, where we provide a draft to City Council, release the budget in May, which will include CIP, and then the vote on the annual cash capital and debt service that's part of the plan through the budget vote process with Council coming up here not too long from now. So I think as we think about, if we just go stay on this slide for a minute, what does the team look at when they're prioritizing projects and funding? So there are a number of things. Clearly, any project with an immediate impact on public safety or something that's immediately required from a statutory or regulatory requirement standpoint would be high on the list. And then projects that leverage outside funding that may have an expiration date, which certainly is true in many cases. Projects that are in their construction year. So, we've gone through a study to determine feasibility on a project. We've gone through design. Now it's time for construction. That would obviously drive priorities. Administration priorities, departmental priorities also play in. And then any investments that would be beneficial from an economic development and home ownership program standpoint also would certainly weigh in on that prioritization. So I mentioned before, kind of the impact on the operating budget and what's focused on there. So I won't go over that again, but it's important to mention that each year, as part of a council resolution in June, there is a debt authorization plan, and that reflects the new debt allocations that are reflected in year 1 of the CIP, as well as any allocations that have been approved in prior years that need to be carried forward. So you'll all see that coming through in June. It's also important to mention that Debt is authorized in that June resolution, but before it can be issued, departments still have to seek council approval for project-specific bond authorizations throughout the year. So said another way, before we even go to issue debt, council will always know about that and will be voting on that before anything progresses further. And as part of those resolutions, we generally include, what the cost of that issuance would be as well. So you would have that information at the point in time that you vote on it. So now we're going to cover a high-level review of the types of projects typically found within each CIP category, not necessarily getting into detail as Councilmember Gruber mentioned earlier about the fiscal 23 projects themselves, but we'll give you a high-level overview of each of the categories. And this may be the highlight of the presentation for some, in that you'll get a break from me talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich Perrin, our Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Services, for him to cover the next few slides. So Rich, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks very much, Director Burns. So we're going to start off with the one that's probably nearest and dearest to my heart from my background coming in, which is transportation and infrastructure. But you're going to see a number of these things. There are several categories of capital improvements for which DES takes the lead on. And we obviously work with other city departments on each of these to make sure that it is a collaborative effort, that we are breaking down silos, and that we're coming up with solutions from a physical standpoint that meet the needs of the city's residents, businesses, and organizations. But starting with transportation infrastructure, you can look at street improvements and maintenance. That includes approximately 537 center lane miles of streets, city streets. Now that's center lane miles. That's just going down the middle of them. Since most of those are 2-lane city streets, we're talking over 1,000 lane miles of streets. Part and parcel of that are the sidewalks that adjoin them. But it's not just the sidewalks we're talking about here. We're also talking about the ramps, Americans with Disabilities Act compliant ramps that we maintain as well as install, and also look at hazardous sidewalk programs that come up, where we've been going through a circular process throughout the city by going into various districts, and not the council districts per se, but a much more finite and larger number of those districts to ensure that we're addressing that. Along with safety, lighting, and signage, I would also add traffic calming as we start to look at that. That's another element of safety that goes into it. Bridges and structures, we're at about 40 city-owned bridges for which we have the primary maintenance responsibility. There's about 20 New York State-owned bridges where we take secondary maintenance responsibility. And then we also have 10 city-owned tunnels. And those tunnels can be areaways and other basically subservice portions of our infrastructure that we need to look at. Moving into the water system, the water is obviously those that are related, pardon me, to our supply and distribution, as well as how we protect that source, what we call our upland source, because it's upland from the sense that it's upstream on the Genesee River, about 30 miles away, with Hemlock and Canadice Lakes. But that shows a lot of what we've been talking about with the ARPA funds, which is the lead service line replacements. And there's really two elements to that. There's the outside lead service lines, effectively what we call the curb box, the tree lawn into the street, for which the city is responsible. And those are our water mains and other lines. And then the inside services, which are the responsibility of property owners, but for which we are looking at it as still being something that we need to take ownership, if not, financially over, or, physically over, definitely providing some resources to ensure that we're meeting federal regulations related to lead and copper, which were recently promulgated within the last couple of years. To date, we have about $21.6 million that's been appropriated and in projects underway for that lead service line replacement. We'll continue to look for those from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also more probably commonly referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Fund. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when we start talking about public facilities and municipal facilities, we're really still talking about approximately 190 city-owned buildings and facilities. And these include the ones that are listed here, including the arena and the War Memorial, the convention center, the community sports complex. I would also be remiss if I didn't add for our Parks and Public Works Committee chairperson that we also have the Port of Rochester Terminal Building and certain adjoining facilities there too, which we're responsible for. And then we have the municipal facilities, which are city-owned buildings and facilities, such as where I'm sitting now at City Hall, our operations center over on Mount Reed, the libraries, firehouses, police stations, and the art centers, obviously very important, as well as parking areas. What I would probably note here is just that we obviously have an aging stock of facilities. We do our absolute best to maintain them by putting in place the right treatment in the right window of opportunity, which is to say that we are doing our absolute best to practice, very, very conscious, high-level, cost-effective asset management. If you let things go too far, they cost you more than if you do your regular, both corrective and preventive maintenance. And we can give multiple examples of how that works. I can speak to it particularly from a street standpoint. But I think what's important to note is that these are, regardless of whether they're termed public or municipal facilities, they are community facilities. They are absolutely critical to quality of life for our residents, as well as to attract visitors, which is outside dollars that are brought into the city as they're spent at places like the Blue Cross Arena, or even from out of town when we're getting people to the convention center. And then also, obviously, we have the community sports complex, which has been, redesignated. I'll call it a few times, but definitely serves our youth, as well as we're having, soccer back there. So there's a lot going on with these facilities. But when you start talking about almost nearly 200 various structures that we're taking care of, it's quite a bit. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is interesting, and this is really a segue from the R centers. When we start talking about parks and open space, this is where we work very closely with the Department of Recreation and Human Services, Dr. Green. Her and I have regular communication, as well as our teams, because this is where there's a responsibility for the physical element of it that I note. If you'll note, I said DES takes the lead for. But when it comes to the programming, the actual use of these, that's really where Dr. Green's team and ours come together, so that we can make sure that what we build is what's needed for the preferred programming, for which they have the purview, as well as I'll just say it flat out, the expertise compared to DES, where we're in the business of building and to some degree maintaining things. But this also extends to our two cemeteries, Riverside and Mount Hope. We have our urban forest, if you will. You've heard the mayor talk about his priority to get up to 7,000 trees in the next 4 years, 3.5 to 4 years. So we're looking at adding about 6,000. And I'll give an example of where we need to start inserting, and we are doing this with our plan for that, a greater focus or lens on equity, and making sure that we're bringing all outcomes out to be the same, regardless of where you may live in the city. I would also add, obviously, the public market and our international plaza. These are, there's how many TV channels right now devoted to food. I mean, this is the fun stuff that people really like. And when we provide that, and we give not just, a restaurant, but the flavor of Rochester, if you will, it's great. And I'll go back and call all of these things part of our urban infrastructure. They're absolutely critical. And that's why they're in the capital improvement program, the CIP, because they are these physical assets, excuse me. And then last, in terms of what I wanted to address, was just the public waterfront. This is where we partner not only with city departments, but also with the county and the state. So projects along our two main waterways, Durand Eastman Beach and the Port of Rochester on Lake Ontario, as well as along the Genesee River. And I joke, if you haven't heard of our Rock the Riverway initiative, which is largely funded with state dollars, then you need to get out from whatever rock you're under, because it is exciting stuff as we begin to turn our face back to the river. So I think it's very apropos that we end with our public waterfront. As the mayor says, there's not many, if any, other cities that have both a lake, a river and a waterfall. And we're trying to take full advantage of all of them from both a quality of life and economic development perspective. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Director Burns. Thanks very much, Mike.
Thanks, Commissioner. And I'm actually going to turn it over for the next slide to Commissioner Dana Miller, Neighborhood and Business Development. Dana?
Thank you, Director, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. In terms of the capital improvement plan, there is a category. It is titled Economic Development, but it actually covers almost everything that NBD does. Specifically, it covers projects that preserve and enhance employment, economy, and tax base of the city, and that also includes the areas that you see listed here: housing and neighborhood physical improvements, infrastructure to support industrial and commercial development, and remediation of contaminated sites. And as you all know, we have many of those in the city. So we are able to take advantage of this capital improvement plan funding for things like remediation of places like Bull's Head Plaza or other areas that we are looking to redevelop under the economic development heading. There is one particular item here that you don't see on the slide, but it is in the spreadsheet. And that is for the fiscal year 23. We normally have every year funding for roof replacements. As you all know, roofs are one of the most desperately sought things that the city helps to support our existing housing base with. Without a solid roof, typically we lose a lot of our properties, and so we dedicate a tremendous amount of effort to helping people replace their roofs. So there is no funding for roof replacement in year one of this current plan, but it does show in years 2 through 5. And the reason for that is that we are using ARPA funds, and we're actually using $7.8 million of ARPA funds for the roofing program. Each year in the CIP, we typically have about $1 million. So as opposed to keeping that $1 million in the CIP, we gave that up, and we will be using ARPA funding for that, but we will be able to do many, many more roofs with the $7.8 million that we have through ARPA. And I can turn it back over to Mike now, and he can wrap this up, and then we'll have questions.
Great, thanks, Commissioner. So just continuing on here, some additional categories up on the slide. Public safety, which covers any of the replacements needed in the areas of police, fire, and emergency communications. Arts and culture, any of our public enhancements and installations, and funded for the 1% for the arts policy. Business equipment, pretty straightforward. Anything that you could imagine would fall under there: office equipment, office furniture, that sort of thing. And non-public safety equipment. So any motor equipment that would be needed by any of our other city departments. For example, a good example would be Department of Environmental Services that would fall into that. So at this point, we've taken you through the fundamentals of the CIP book, and we'll give a little bit of an overview of the funding for the 2022-23 CIP, or year one of the CIP. And you can see that up here on the screen. And I think, picture is worth 1,000 words. So what you're looking at here includes all funding sources by category, and the total across all categories is all funding sources, I should say, is $99,129,000. So that is a lot of capital investment that is planned for the upcoming year. And you can see the categories over which it breaks down, with transportation and infrastructure being the largest, and then municipal facilities, and then the balance spread across a number of categories. So if we look here, another way to look at it is the cash capital piece by fund. So whereas the previous slide showed combination, the total of cash and debt by category, this looks at cash capital by fund. The largest being the general fund, which is our largest fund and really encompasses the primary operations of government, of city government, and then you can see the spread across the other funds that we have shown here.
Director Burns, can you just give a 1-minute synopsis of what those other funds are?
I can, yes. So cemetery is comprised of our 2 cemeteries being Mount Hope and Riverside. Animal control is comprised of animal services. Water would largely be our water bureau, which rolls up under DES. Refuse and local works also falling under DES. The public market being the public market. The War Memorial being the activity that involves the War Memorial, also referred to as the Blue Cross Arena. Parking covers all of our city-owned parking garages. It also covers any traffic or municipal violations, among other things. And then the library covers Rundell and all of our other branches across the city.
Thanks. And just more specifically, what makes each fund be its own fund? It's because of revenue coming in? Can you just give a little explainer on that?
Yeah, so there are certain of the funds that are supported by tax revenues, and then there are others of the funds that are self-supported from revenues generated from local works fees and I should say service charges and fees. Examples of those would be local works, refuse, and water. Tax supported would be, among others, the general fund, probably be the biggest one there.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks for that question. And then looking at debt, same idea. So broken down by fund, again, general fund comprising most of the debt that's contemplated in CIP, and then water, refuse, parking, local works, and library making up the balance. And then we saw this at the beginning, but we'll see it here at the end. And just this is the CIP summary by funding source, which is one of the financial summaries that I talked about earlier. So you can see, significant capital investment contemplated in the upcoming year's budget through a mix of cash capital, debt, and other funding sources. But you can see too, significant magnitude of projects included in the plan in years 2 through 5. And then, as I mentioned earlier, as we get into, for example, the budget cycle for 2023-24, we evaluate the inventory of projects that make up what you're currently seeing in that column in the out years, and prioritize and refine costs and determine, based on where the city's finances are anticipated to stand, what it is that we're able to do, in the course of that given upcoming budget year. So with that, I hope that we have provided useful information and provided I think, as you referred to it, Councilmember Gruber, a bit of a 101 on the capital investment program and how that all works. So I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point for the balance of the work session to cover questions or whatever it is that we might do with the remaining time.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone, Commissioner Miller, Commissioner Perrin. See Commissioner Green on the call too. Thanks to everyone for your time today. So I'll open it up to any council member who has questions about the content we covered today.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Just related to, I know that we're in unique times with ARPA, but also there's infrastructure dollars. I don't know that all of those have hit the city yet. Do we anticipate that changing the priorities, if not this year, but in future years in terms of how we invest in the CIP? Meaning, do we anticipate that that may cover some of the costs that we're anticipating now?
I will let Commissioner Perrin chime in because infrastructure is near and dear to his heart. But I would say, President Melendez, that I would anticipate for those infrastructure dollars a similar impact to what we've seen for ARPA, right? So, if we didn't have ARPA, as Commissioner Miller mentioned, there'd be certain things that we'd have to fund through the CIP. And I think that the infusion of ARPA has allowed us to undertake certain projects more quickly than we otherwise would be able to. Similarly here, especially given, what we saw in one of the prior slides about how of all the categories, infrastructure was the most significant. I think that will certainly allow us to cycle through those projects more quickly. And I say that with a little bit of hesitation because I know Commissioner Perrin will remember that I've said that. So, but Rich, anything that you have to add in that regard? I know you're pretty well dialed into all things infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's a great question because a lot of it isn't coming out yet. They're still working through these programs. These were new programs, and I'm probably going to tell you more than you want to know about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but I'm going to start with saying that it wasn't developed by the typical congressional committees that do these things. So there in the House, there's the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. These were all deals that were being cut by congressional leadership at both the House and the Senate. So there are a lot of these programs that came out they tried to use existing programs as much as they could, but they created new ones. And those new ones then required, notice of proposed rulemaking and the whole federal process before they can start hitting the streets, literally. So of that, it was a $1.2 trillion bill, of which $550 billion was new. The remaining went to existing programs. $284 billion of the 550 went to transportation. We would be looking at that and going, great. But it wasn't always necessarily put into the pots that are most advantageous to the city directly. So for example, as part of that, there was a large sustainability component. So transit and rail, they saw a lot. Vehicle charging stations, which we would like to take advantage of, saw a lot. When it actually came to highways and bridges, which is to say highways are also streets, it wasn't so much streets. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials has a very powerful lobby. So the pot of funding that saw most of the funding for highways, roads, and streets goes to principal arterials, which are interstates and major roadways that are typically owned by those state DOTs. So while they saw a nice bump in the percent increase for that program, the amount that we look to, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, only saw a couple percent increase. And even that, other than a smaller sub-allocated component directly to the Rochester urbanized area, which goes beyond the city, is still controlled by the state. So it was really the state DOTs that won out again on that. I mentioned 284 billion of the 550 billion new. The other 266 billion went to power. That's not necessarily something we're going to see. But 55 billion did go to water. So we're definitely going to be looking at taking advantage of that. That is a program that will go through the state, but I'm going to be very blunt about it. Anytime we can get somebody else to pay for our stuff, that's what we're looking for. When Director Burns showed that slide with state, federal, county, that's what we're looking for. There was also money for broadband, and we had some outreach from the Biden administration. It happened to be a former mayor from Chattanooga, so he reached out to Mayor Evans. Again, partnerships, we're talking with the county. The county is really who right now has a lot of the telecommunications infrastructure, not necessarily just the conduit, which is the sheathing, but the actual fiber strands that go into that. So how do we figure out how to get that into areas that are underserved? Because a for-profit driven telecommunications company is not going to necessarily go into the places where we need it the most. So we have to work on that. We have to work very hard on that. There's also environmental remediation and resiliency. But really the key ones were the broadband at 65 billion, the water at 55 billion, and the resiliency at 47 billion, that we want to wait to see what the rules of those games are. And then we want to be as competitive as we can in playing for those dollars. So like I said, I think you asked me for the time. I told you how to build a watch. I do apologize for that, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of background.
I appreciate that. And I have one final follow-up for now, at least. So year over year, the CIP, obviously the first year is what matters most, but it would be helpful for us to understand as council members if projects have been pushed back or pushed forward. Is there any possibility of doing some analysis with our team? I mean, certainly our team can do some work too, but just to understand what nuance or what changes we've seen year over year in terms of the 5-year timeline.
Yeah, I'm just making a note there, and we'll certainly follow up on that, because I think that that would certainly be instructive to understand, when in any given year when the 5-year plan is presented, right? How does that change in future years, and how much of what's presented for the out years actually gets done? We can certainly look at some of that and work with the team to do that and get you that.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Councilmember Gruber. Commissioner Perrin, you mentioned that we certainly want more resources to go into the communities hardest hit and that need the resources most. And you mentioned that hard work was being done around that. Can you talk a little bit more about what work is being done to make that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important to remember that as we came in, and Director Burns had showed sort of the schedule of where this starts. So we're coming into this while it's really already riding using the existing process. One of the things we need to do, and I'll give you the example of our plan for the trees, right? For the addition of these trees. I can pull it out and give you the specifics. But our goal is to have an equal number of stocking fillings in every single quadrant in the city. So while the Southeast right now is already above 80%, and the Northeast and the Northwest are in the 60s and 70%, when we're done, we want to be citywide 85%, and our goal is to be 85% in every single quadrant. So when we start to look at this, we need to assess where are these things? Because when you look at it at a citywide basis, you're not granular enough to understand where the shortfalls are for those various communities. So I think, the deputy mayor as well as Director Burns would agree, when we go through this, we can start to put together different criteria that start to look at it from how do we start to work towards the same outcomes wherever we are throughout the city. That's something that has to go in. So you're going to add that into the things that we may already look at, for example, like on our street infrastructure. Well, we look at, number of vehicles and condition. Well, that is a very high level analysis, and it's important because it gets you into use and the integrity of the infrastructure. But what are the reasons behind it? Maybe there's not a lot of vehicles using a particular street because there's a high number of zero vehicle households on that street. So let's dig into the numbers a little more to not just ask what's happening, but why it's happening. And so that's the part that we're starting to look at throughout our processes at DES. Now, keep in mind that the process that Director Burns outlined is we have to set our priorities, and then we put those forward to Office of Management and Budget to look citywide. So these are the things we're already having conversations on in DES, recognizing that the minute we have a budget adopted, we're going to start working on the next one, inclusive of the CIP for 23-24, because that's where we can put our mark on it. So a lot of it is happening in terms of sort of talking about it from the contextual perspective, but we need to make it tactical and operational. So that's where we need to look in and say, okay, if this is what we're trying to accomplish, what are the specific criteria that get us there?
Yeah, and I would add to that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the financial discipline around the process as it exists with the mix of cash and debt is strong. But I think, Commissioner Perrin and I have talked about this, there's opportunity to, as he's mentioned, just further refine the prioritization and, also enhance how we communicate this information, right? I mean, if I put this on the website today, would the average person be able to pick it up and understand it? And, do they need to understand it, through all of the pages of the book? Maybe not, but again, would they be able to have an understanding of where we are investing? And, would they be able to look at, click on a particular project and get information about that and have more meaningful information available to them? So, we've got a lot of opportunity here to build upon that strong, foundation of good financial discipline as to how this is developed and make it even better. And we're excited to work through that here as we go into future years.
Thanks. And Councilmember Smith, I would just add one other piece to your question, which is to say that the slide that Director Burns put up about timelines. I mean, we have to be cognizant of the fact that the work on this budget started before Director Burns was in the position, before Commissioner Perrin, before Commissioner Green, before any of these folks, before the deputy mayor were in their positions. And at the same time, a lot of this work had to be done before there was any kind of conclusion around what the state budget was going to look like, and even what some of these big federal bills were going to look like. So I do think that I've never been through a transition before as a council member, but I would imagine that the budget for this year is going to have some of that imprint on it, that it's part of this kind of longer transition period. And I think that the budget of next year that we look at is really going to have the kind of full stamp of the Evans administration. And on top of that, it's going to be fully cognizant of all the different funding streams that are available or that are evaporating at that point. So I don't know that that's a clean answer to your question, but I do think that's part of it.
It was, yes, it was good. Thank you so much for putting that into perspective for me, because that is exactly what I was getting at and what I wanted to know.
Got it.
Thank you.
Councilmember Pio.
Thank you very much. We're seeing an unprecedented influx of federal dollars while also looking to increase our debt ceiling. Where are we seeing opportunities to invest that money in tax revenue producing assets?
Could you be a little more specific on that question?
Sure. The business side of me says that when I increase my debts, I have to be using that debt to be producing income. So we have a lot of money coming in. We're expending a lot of money, but where do we see money that we could invest that could produce some type of income for the city that we never saw before? Meaning maybe more brownfield cleanup, more CDBG dollars to increase businesses, that increases tax revenues. Where do we see opportunity to really invest in the future where we can increase our tax base?
I think I'm gonna, Deputy Mayor, you unmuted. Did you have something there?
Yeah, I'll try to answer it. A lot of the projects that we're doing are to significantly improve the attractiveness of living in and doing business in the city. And I think that's one of the main drivers. A lot of these projects, I think in a few years, the downtown area and even the outside of downtown are going to look very different and be much more attractive. And I think that's going to drive a lot of revenue to the city. I think that's the answer that I would give to the question, Councilman. The other thing I wanted to add on a different subject, and this is dovetailing what President Melendez said, when we find out what's going on with the infrastructure monies and how much we can get and for what, and I believe that'll happen, it's going to impact our ARPA recommendations. So we will substitute where we can the infrastructure revenue for what we've already assigned with ARPA monies, and that will free up those ARPA monies to do even other things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So I think you're going to see changes in ARPA allocations in the coming months. But Councilman, I hope I answered your question.
Kind of. I can see maybe like increasing on the public market. I don't know, does the cemetery make us money? Does it make us? I know revenues come in for the cemetery, but the amount of money that we put into the cemetery, are we getting more back in revenues?
Councilmember
No.
Peel, sorry, someone was about to
Oh,
respond.
it's Suzanne. I was gonna say, the cemeteries still remain a heavily property tax supported enterprise. We do not collect enough in revenue to offset that whole operation.
Yeah,
Councilmember
Council-
Peel, I just feel like that's starting to get into the place where we're going to turn this into like a budget hearing versus
I gotcha.
just kind of, certainly we'll have time to ask those questions about what the city is putting money into funds and what's creating revenue for us. But if you don't mind, I'd rather just put a pause on that since it's 4:58 right now. Are you okay with that?
I understand. Thank you.
Any last questions from council members on the CIP 101 type of stuff? Well, I just want to say thank you to the small but mighty OMB team who put this together, and good to hear from you, Suzanne. And I saw Christina somewhere, and thanks to the council staff and James and Katie and everyone and Beth for putting this all together. Hopefully this was helpful. Certainly we'll still have a really robust hearing later on in May about this and some other things, but I think this was a really good foundation. And with that, President Melendez, I'll give it back to you unless you want to just close up.
Just one last comment. I'd be remiss if I failed to thank Christina from my team. Just a great job in putting this presentation together and in working with council's office. So appreciate that effort, and also just appreciate the opportunity to provide this kind of overview and work with council in this way to make sure that you have the information you need to undertake your responsibilities. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. This has been helpful, and I'm sure we have a lot more questions that we'll save for the hearing, but we greatly appreciate the work that you put into this. Have a good day, everyone.